Okay, we are live.
Thank you, Zach. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's episode of What's the Tea here at Anew, Building Beyond Violence and Abuse. We have a pretty interesting topic today. I've got a superhero shirt on. We're going to be talking about superheroes. And so superheroes actually reflect a lot about us. Superheroes have been around for decades. They document our evolution. Superheroes have been around for our world's most tragic events. So as our society has evolved, so too have the stories within these comics and films. Each story reflecting not only superheroes with incredible abilities, but also individuals and groups with unimaginable masses of trauma. So today we're going to be talking about how our very own trauma and hardships are actually reflected in superhero lore. And I have here with me our very own Friendly Neighborhood Executive Director, Jennifer Gabrenia.
Hi, Celeste. Good to be back here on What's the Tea?
Thanks for being here with us. We feel like it's been a few months since we've been on here together.
Yeah.
So we might be a little rusty today, but it's all good.
And good job with the superhero tie-in on the Friendly Neighborhood Executive Director.
That's right. And so my first question to you, Jennifer, I know that you love your comics, your superheroes, you and your family are deep into that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to ask, how did you first get into this superhero interest?
Yeah, I have my husband to blame for that for the most part. So I'll let everyone know I'm not so much into reading the actual comic books themselves. But definitely got sort of sucked in when the movies started to come out, particularly when the MCU started to really create their world a little bit more. And then, in watching those with my husband and in talking with him, like he would teach me a little bit more about it. And then I would find a character interesting. And we have several encyclopedias. Some of you don't know, there's encyclopedias of the Marvel universe or the DC universe. And then we would go in and there's so many superheroes and supervillains, you can't possibly imagine how huge the universes are. And we would read a little bit, dig into who they are and what their origins are and what they're about, kind of in trying to figure out the tie-in for the storyline. So that's how I got pulled into it.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I honestly didn't know much about superheroes until having my two boys. Growing up, I grew up around a lot of girls, my nieces, my little sister, and now I have boys and they're teaching me a lot about superheroes, their bedtime stories and movies that we watch together. So I find it really interesting too. I have some catching up to do though.
Yeah, I mean, I knew obviously about some of the main superheroes when I was growing up, but getting the stories are very rich and they're very deep. And because of the nature of a comic book, the writer spent a lot of time like really deeply developing these characters and their personalities and what their powers reflect. And particularly, so I am more of a Marvel universe person than a DC universe person. So that's an important distinction for people who are into it all. But in the Marvel universe, there really was an intention to create characters that people could relate to more. So for instance, with Superman, it's a little bit harder for people to relate to Superman because Superman is an alien. Superman is from another planet. Superman's powers are extremely unattainable. Superman is always depicted as being very good all around, doesn't really have a lot of flaws historically. But when you look at more of the Marvel characters, like Spider-Man, for instance, right? Spider-Man Peter Parker is a kid, a high school kid, in New York, and it just happens to him. And then, and he's still a kid. He's still a teenager, being a teenager and trying to figure everything out along the way. So particularly in the MCU, the characters are purposefully more relatable and where you can say, I could see myself being friends with them.
Yeah, I like that. Very relatable. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to dive deep into, the background stories of these superheroes and the traumas that they've been through. But before we do that, can you tell us what you think it means to be a superhero?
Yeah, so a superhero basically is a person who, when we think about hero, someone who's trying to do good. They want to do good. They've got this moral compass that's pushing them towards doing good, even though sometimes we might question the methods that they're using to do good. And then the super part is generally there's something about them that makes them different or stand apart from others, and usually it's some sort of power, some sort of ability that is out of the ordinary for humans to have. Some of them are not human at all. Some of them are aliens that look like humans and end up being on the planet, but in a nutshell.
Nutshell, yeah. Someone who's trying to do good. And I like that you said sometimes we may not agree with the methods.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the learning process, even in the comics and in the movies, is that sometimes superheroes make mistakes.
Yeah. And people have to think they're a hero. I guess that's important too. For them to be a superhero, other people have to call them a hero. That person generally isn't calling themselves a hero. They're perceived as being a hero.
Yeah. So how do some of these superheroes reflect the individual and societal traumas that many experience every day? If you can just give us a few examples, maybe go into one or two that you'd like to cover.
Yeah, I think before I get into that, I'd like to kind of set what we're talking about when we say trauma, because I think we all have all these different ideas about what we think trauma is or what it means. So I have my favorite definition from Dr. Judith Herman that I'm going to go ahead and read to everyone just to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page when I'm talking about what trauma, right? These heroes, and I'm going to include villains in there, these super characters have had. So psychological trauma is an affliction of the powerless. So I think that's a really important piece when you think about someone experiencing trauma. They were in a situation where they had no power to change what was happening. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by an overwhelming force. When the force is that of nature, we speak of disasters. So when we think of tornadoes, flash floods, things like that as a natural disaster is traumatic. When the force is that of other human beings, we speak of atrocities. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. So those three words are very important and will become pretty obvious when we start talking about it, because again, it's that idea of not being in control of anything, of feeling disconnected to what matters to you, and not feeling that you have meaning or that you have a purpose. So before we started all of this, we were all talking about how the pandemic just fits so perfectly into that definition. And that's something that everyone watching this can relate to. Everyone can relate to feeling powerless, maybe even still now, but definitely in the beginning of not knowing what to do, of not having control over what was happening, losing connections to the people and places that usually would bring you comfort because we were told to isolate. And then, and meaning, there were a lot of people that did a lot of soul searching and trying to figure out, what does life really mean to me? And am I really fulfilling my purpose with what I'm doing right now? And you've seen a lot of people change course based on what they learned there. So when we're talking about these traumas, that's what we're talking about in these. Typically, it's the origin story of a hero or a villain. The origin has a traumatic element to it. And then sometimes throughout their story, they continually have trauma. So you're looking at people that have complex trauma and they keep experiencing trauma. How many times do you have to save the world, right? As a hero, it's in theory traumatic every single time they have to save the world.
Exactly.
Every time they go into that, they could die.
Yeah.
And often they
and that's trauma
on their teams. So who do we want to start with as an example?
and that's just how relatable this is. I like that you mentioned the pandemic and how you mentioned previous to us starting to record was that we all have our own trauma, but now there's not one person that can say that I have not lived through any type of trauma. As long as you've lived through this pandemic, we've all had that fear of possibly dying. So we can all relate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to start with a superhero that most people are familiar with and whose storyline most people are familiar with, I think it's easy to start off with Spider-Man.
Okay.
Spider-Man is a pretty prolific superhero, and most people are pretty aware that the pivotal moment in Spider-Man's origin story. So isn't necessarily when Spider-Man gets bit by the spider. Spider-Man gets bit by a radioactive spider. That's when Spider-Man, Peter Parker, gets the powers. But the pivotal moment in Peter Parker's story is when his Uncle Ben is murdered.
Yeah.
And in some of the storylines, so there's a couple of different movies and comic books that will look at the origin of that, but in particular there's this sense later on that Peter Parker realizes he could have prevented Uncle Ben's murder, but he made a choice not to intervene in a situation, and that resulted in his Uncle Ben being murdered. And that's pivotal for him because Uncle Ben and Aunt May are essentially Peter Parker's caretakers. He loses his parents or is abandoned by his parents early on and doesn't live with them anymore. So that's our first loss, which we really don't know a whole lot about. But we know that
they don't show that too much in the movies.
Yeah, it's not depicted too much in the movies. It's not discussed or shared a whole lot when you talk about Peter Parker's life, but there is a lot of that focus on the loss of Uncle Ben and how that really shapes him, and how that realization of I had the power, that if I would have made a different choice, over here, he might still be alive. And he has a very difficult time forgiving himself. And pretty much his being a superhero is him trying to forgive himself over and over again for not having intervened.
Yeah.
And then losing Uncle Ben. And another piece of what's pivotal here with Peter Parker, when he's known as Spider-Man, you see him struggle throughout as to whether or not he is going to be open about his identity as is Spider-Man Peter Parker. How does he want people to know? Is he going to tell people? So that kind of parallels something that we were talking about earlier, are people who are in populations that feel othered or cast out or left out because they're different in some way, and having to decide whether they're going to let people know about their difference or not. And then what are the consequences? So Peter Parker has to grapple with the consequences of, if people know who he is, he's not worried about himself being in danger so much as being seen as a hero and a target, but he's worried about the people around him being in danger. He comes to realize that if people know that Spider-Man is Peter Parker, his loved ones are going to be in danger because they are going to be targeted. And so he has to make a choice to separate himself. Right? He has to lose connections, sever connections again, because he wants to keep the people that he loves safe.
Yeah. And I feel like these disconnections after a traumatic event might have to do with him not having a hard time trying to find his sense of self, or, his personality, his character. I saw that in the movies too, him having a hard time just trying to find who he is.
Yeah. Well, when you have, because sometimes they're distinct. Like when you sometimes the hero persona is quite different than the non-hero persona. So, I mean, Superman's a great one for that, right? Like the Clark Kent is really different from Superman. You
Yeah,
know, they're worlds apart, and that's on purpose. You know, Superman Kal-El does that on purpose because he doesn't want there to be anything about the Clark persona that would cause people to think that that's who Superman is.
exactly. It also makes me think of Batman, because Batman is the most, he kind of strays away from having any type of relationship with anyone at all. Like, do we really know who Batman really is in the series after everything that's happened to him? I feel like maybe he hadn't found himself.
Yeah, I think Batman is one of those people. So to go back to the traumatic event, so here, Batman's parents are shot dead while standing right next to him.
As a
Batman
child.
has a lot of money, but not a lot of caretaking. So Batman doesn't even have actual caretakers, right? That he doesn't have anyone that becomes his parents. He's in the care Alfred, who is the only sort of father figure to him, but isn't really ever depicted as an actual parent or, you know, caretaker in the traditional sense that we would think of as a caretaker. And so you see Batman, yeah, pushing everyone away
Yeah.
consistently and really not going there, really not wanting wanting to go there and look at that traumatic past at all. Batman
Yeah,
doesn't want to do
exactly.
that.
That's one of my favorite things about Batman is because he doesn't have any special ability or any superpower. He's
Yeah, so
actually a
that's why I try
regular
to be
person.
careful, right? And what makes someone a superhero, because not all superheroes actually have powers. So it isn't necessarily that they have a power or ability.
Yeah.
Most of the time that they do, Batman has a lot of money.
Yep.
Batman is extremely
Gadgets.
intelligent, you know, has gadgets, has people who can build things, but does not have superpowers.
So I feel like he might be, to me, he's just so relatable because of that, because he's a regular person, with a goal. And aren't we all?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and for the most part, superheroes have a goal. And for
Yeah.
quite a few of them, you know, they want the world to be a better place, or they want to right uh, a really big wrong. You know, they want to look at something that's a wrong and they want to make it right. Um, and sometimes they don't know exactly how to go about doing that. Often they're alone because they think that no one else will understand them.
Yeah.
They won't understand what they've been through. They won't understand why they're so focused on the goal that they're focused on, or why they're choosing the methods that they're choosing. And I do think these are things that we can all relate to. We can all, most people right now with the pandemic can relate to having a traumatic experience of having a loss and then having to figure out, what do I do with that? You know, does that fuel me in one way or the other? And some heroes spend some time wallowing, for lack of a better word, you know, because they don't know what to do. So for example, in the MCU, as you get towards Infinity War and you get towards Endgame, you have Thor, who is one of my all-time favorites. The depiction of Thor in the MCU is fantastic. But you have Thor who sees himself as he didn't stop Thanos from doing the snap. And he really felt that he should have, that he made the wrong choice that resulted in Thanos still being able to do this. And you see him go, he just spirals because of that. And
That's a lot of regret.
He has a lot of regret. He steps completely out of any leadership role. He becomes an alcoholic, drinking all of the time, playing video games with the friends that he had made when he was imprisoned, and not wanting to have anything to do at all with the life that he had before, wanting to put it completely behind him, because he thought that he should have the power to make a difference, and it ended up that he didn't. And
Yeah.
no matter how powerful he was, there was absolutely nothing
That takes me back to a question that I was going to ask, is how have superheroes coped with the trauma that they've experienced? And that's kind of how Thor coped in the beginning, right? And we saw a lot of mistakes being made in the beginning, right? Right after the trauma. You talked about Thor. I also saw how Spider-Man was saving the world, but he was actually only going for the criminals who looked like the person who killed his uncle. And so a lot of these coping mechanisms were, like you say, we don't always agree with.
Yeah, well, and everybody, they're not even necessarily conscious
Exactly.
coping mechanisms. So my guess is going to be that Peter Parker wasn't sitting there going, this kind of person at this height with this color hair, and most likely not, right?
No.
And Thor probably didn't even, it's not a conscious choice. It's I'm retreating into what feels safe.
Yes.
Or what I can control in
Exactly.
that moment. Because when you lose all control, you want to find something that you can control. And sometimes that thing that you can control isn't necessarily healthy for you. And so we see that a lot. I think that's another way that it's really relatable when you watch the movies, and what people related to when they read the comics, because the comics are the precursors to the movies, and that's what people could relate to. They're doing the things that I do, because it's very common for people when they've experienced trauma to turn to substances.
Yes.
That's why you see such a huge overlap between substance abuse and any kind of traumatic experience, because it's because it helps people escape. It changes the way their body feels so that they don't have to feel, right, those feelings of the trauma and the aftermath of that. So you see that with the way that Thor reacts, and then you see that with the other one that comes to mind quickly is Jessica Jones, who is a lesser known. And some people will probably be like, is she a hero? Is she not a hero? She's one of those, like, in the Marvel universe that they sometimes call anti-heroes, where sometimes they seem like they're doing good things, but sometimes you're not so sure that they're doing good things. But she's absolutely an alcoholic. And that is part of who she is. That's part of how she copes. It is very clear that that is her coping mechanism, and that's what she wants to do. And that's part of how she deals with her experiences. And then I think another part that's kind of funny when we think about, I just want to make sure that we're not saying like it's always going to be negative, because it's not.
Right.
So you also see in the MCU, after the snap and 50% of the planet disappears, you see Steve Rogers, Captain America, leading a support group. So he's leading a support group of people who lost loved ones in the snap and then are trying to figure out how they're going to move on. And so you do see some of that, where that's a character who's like, I help people, right? That's part of his superhero persona, is helping people, and also always being kind of like the good guy. Superhero is who he is. And so he's leading, that's like a natural, makes sense. Like he's leading a support group to help folks.
Yeah. And I see a lot of these superheroes on a day-to-day basis in real life are people that have been through trauma themselves and, support others who are going through it now.
Yeah, all these other people leading support groups, right? There are a lot of people who come to work, and I can even use our work, in domestic violence, gender-based violence, sexual assault work. A lot of the people who come into this work have experienced the trauma, and they have had their negative coping mechanisms, they have had their positive coping mechanisms, they have gotten to a point where they've been able to process it, and they use, right, those tools and skills and special abilities that they figured out to continue to help others.
Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to talk about X-Men. I know we talked about a few different other superheroes before this.
Yeah, we have a clip that we can show to kind of provide an example of what this looks like in the movie. So this is a trigger warning clip. So this is from X-Men. In the opening scene in X-Men, you see the pivotal character Magneto as a child. He and his family are Jewish, and this is a fictional depiction of his family being brought to a concentration camp during World War II, and how that impacts him. So this is a trigger warning. If folks want to, it's going to take about 3 minutes to show the clip. If folks want to shut this off and walk away for 3 minutes, and then maybe come back just for the discussion portion of it, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to share my screen. That's not the right one. Here it is. Okay. Okay, and I'm going to play the clip, and again, it's about a 3-minute clip. Pardon me, I have a little bit of a cough. So it's a pretty intense scene.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit hard when you look at just that to be like, wait a minute, that's from a superhero movie? Superhero movies are supposed to be fun.
True.
They're supposed to be uplifting, you know, all these thoughts about that. But the X-Men franchise is newer comparatively speaking, to some of the other franchises, and is another one of those where the characters are again meant to be very relatable. They're meant to be, they are basically regular people, and the idea is that they have a mutant gene, and at some point that manifests. So in here you see the mutant powers or the mutant gene manifesting. This is the origin of the Magneto character, whose mutant ability is that he can control metal. And you see that the trauma he experiences is what manifests the ability here in the scene. And you can see how that this moment and the things that happen immediately after that are what shape him for the rest of his life, and are what shape him to be. Initially, this particular character is cast as a hero, and then breaks, and then becomes cast as a villain, because of his belief, which is rooted in mutant equality, but then kind of comes to the same place where humans are, where in the storyline humans are afraid of mutants, and start to think of ways to eradicate them. And he comes to believe that there can be no equality because they will never see us as equal, and then sort of also kind of wants them all then to have to become mutants or get out of the way.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of societal trauma, because, like you said, there are a small number of mutants on the planet, but altogether, these mutants are victims of societal trauma. And that's something that we definitely see and experience here, whether it's because of our skin color, because of our sexual orientation, because of our religion, just to name a few factors. But it's definitely something that the whole world can definitely relate with. It's something that happens all the time. It's too common.
Yeah, so it's carried on. I think that you don't, in the X-Men, you don't always see, or his origin isn't always present, nor is his Jewish identity necessarily always present, but continuing through is this, the othering, is the discrimination, is the wanting to kill people who are like you, which is rooted in what his childhood experience was in that opening scene, and is a reality for so many people. And so I think you asked a question about, or maybe you were going to, about how it relates to it, or how it necessarily might help people to find their own healing. And so I think it's sort of, sometimes these superheroes and supervillains do the things that we really want to do.
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes they exact vengeance in ways that we kind of really want to, deep down inside. And so being able to see that portrayed and acted out and get pulled into that story can be helpful, because those are revenge fantasies are normal. They call them revenge fantasies, or this idea of wanting, that's normal. That's a normal reaction. What's harmful is when you act on doing that. And most people don't, but it can be cathartic to see what it would be like if someone did.
Yeah.
Or
and I think that's part of what's relatable, is that, if these stories were just the perfect person, doing everything, growing up happy and nothing went wrong at all, would we actually relate with these stories? And so I feel like that's what makes this relatable, is that, they might have this vengeance and they learn from it. And then at the end, they can change from that and find their true selves. And we're all kind of going through something similar to that.
Yeah, and they are like a lot of them, right? You can see yourself
Yep.
Oftentimes in them.
Exactly.
And you know, some of the characters are silly and don't seem too super. So the Guardians of the Galaxy are a group that kind of come to my mind, that they're, you know, I mean, they're kind of super, they have abilities, except that Peter Quill really has absolutely nothing exceptional for the most part about him, although you find out later that he kind of does, but then he chooses not to use that part of him that could be exceptional. So they are relatable, you know, they are people that you're like, if I'm a superhero, I could see myself being this person. And then people do. So then, like, as an outgrowth of comic books and of superhero movies, now there's like this whole other world of conventions and Comic-Cons and cosplay where people can then embody that person, that superhero or that supervillain that they connect with. They can dress as that person, and they can go to a place where other people are like, I also relate to these storylines and I also relate to these characters. And so I'm going to become that character for a day. And these are like adults, you know, these are, you know, giving adults an opportunity to embody that person and what they stand for. And at the same time, having fun while doing it, which when you think about it is often like, you know, sort of like grown-up play therapy sometimes to a certain extent, because you get a chance to escape your everyday life. Some people become and embody characters that are absolutely nothing like their everyday selves, that if people knew that's what they went off and did on the weekends, they'd probably, you know, drop their jaw on the ground. But it gives that ability. And if we didn't have the comic books and we didn't have the movies, that outlet wouldn't be there for people.
Yeah. And that's why I love Halloween. Why not do it more often, right?
Well, if you go to a Comic-Con, you can do it more often.
I mean, I'm like a kid. Every Halloween, I have a new costume with my kids, and sometimes we're matching. Last year, I was Spider-Woman.
Oh,
Gwen,
nice.
Spider-Gwen.
I've been Spider-Gwen also, and it's fun to figure out who those characters are. And then there's a part of it that's representation, which you had mentioned before, which is a little bit controversial sometimes in the comic book world, because a lot of the comic book heroes have traditionally been white, but more, I'd say more recently in the last 3 to 5 years, there has been intention to lift up the superheroes that exist that aren't always white. And that representation is so important to people. I remember when we went to Comic-Con and I was Spider-Gwen, I never had so many little girls come up to me before than when I was Spider-Gwen, wanting to come up to me and take pictures of me because they saw someone dressed as a hero that they really connected with.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, so just one thing that I wanted to just bring up. I don't know about you, but I've never seen any of these superheroes go get some type of therapy or some type of counseling.
Except for when Steve Rogers.
See, I knew you were gonna.
So I have to think. Like I said,
has that happened?
I'm not familiar with the comic books themselves. It might have happened.
Okay.
But it isn't something that's often presented, right? So that's what my family does. Like my family sits there on the couch and says, oh, they really need to go to therapy.
Yes.
This person needs to go to therapy. They have a lot of different therapy. They need to be in, you know, we make up our own idea of what superheroes need to be in a support group and who has trauma on top of trauma, and knowing that if it's not addressed, right, it's just going to keep building, which is typically what you see when you continue to follow a superhero. You see them falling into the same hole, over and over again, because they're
maybe not talking about the issue.
Yeah, they sometimes don't evolve that way. Occasionally they do. They'll make some changes, but some of them don't, and they, you know, they're not intending, you know, necessarily to do that. So that's a place where sometimes it really does break off from reality.
Yeah.
where it can be really fun to watch them. But when you really stop and think about it, you're like, wow, they all need to be in therapy.
Yes.
They need to be in a lot of therapy. Well, Moon Knight goes to therapy. I should say. Moon Knight is one of the ones that's more recently, but in the Moon Knight in the comics, not depicted so much in the show that just came out, and I don't know a lot about this. And I don't know if I should even say Moon Knight goes to therapy, because Moon Knight is in a psychiatric residential facility. So I'm saying that because those aren't always therapeutic.
Okay.
But that is a hero that, again, one of the heroes that is lesser known that has been lifted up. And that hero it's very open throughout that storyline that the hero has dissociative identity disorder, and that really plays a big role in the storyline and part of who that character is. So a lot of times, and then in Jessica Jones that ran a couple of years ago, it was very she didn't necessarily go to therapy. At some point she went to therapy, but they're very open that she has post-traumatic stress disorder. So her origin story was traumatic, but more so a big piece of the storyline is that she was the supervillain in the TV series that came out. Can control people, can control their minds and control their thoughts. And he controlled her for years in an intimate relationship. So essentially she was raped because she didn't have the agency to be able to say no to anything that he was controlling her to do. So that's made very clear. She calls it out as rape, and it's very clear that she has PTSD. And I say she went to some therapy because they show that she has grounding techniques.
Okay.
Throughout. She had to get that from somewhere. And her parents die when she's young. She has to go live with another family. So there's some kind of intervention that has happened there, but by and large you don't really see it.
No. Yeah. And even if maybe not therapy, but just open dialogue about the traumatic experience, I think the reason why I brought it up was just to stress how important it is to actually talk about the experience, even if it's not therapy, even if it's not counseling, although that is what we would recommend. Talking about it with one of your loved ones and, not just holding it in is definitely a way to cope and a way to heal.
Yes, because when you put it out there is when you create that connection, right? So it goes back to that definition that part of trauma is losing the connection. So for some folks, the more traumatic piece of the whole thing is losing the connection and feeling alone. Sometimes the more traumatic piece is what happened after the event, as opposed to the event itself. And when you're feeling alone and you've lost the connections and you can't find the meaning in your life, that's what really, for the long term, impacts people. And talking about it and connecting with it and having someone who validates your experience is huge for people. Even for someone, yes, we all want everyone to go to therapy. We know the reality is that not everyone goes to therapy or thinks that therapy is for them, but it is important to resolve a traumatic experience, because if you don't resolve a traumatic experience, it will stay with you in a variety of different ways, and it will keep coming up and it will keep impacting your life.
Yeah, so all these different ways of healing, these films can help us heal, but I also feel like they help us find our own superpower, our own superhero. I think they do. A lot of people will look at someone and say, yeah, if I was a superhero, that would be me. Or these are the superpowers, that I would have, or that's a thing the superhero does, and I'm kind of like them. To me, that's what, like, it most closely relates to that cosplay thing, right? Because I think that's why people choose the characters they choose, because it's more than Halloween. People put a lot of thought and a lot of time. I mean, some of these are very, very
professional and they're doing it because they connect and they relate to that person. But there's quite a few storylines where you realize that what really is the most special about that hero is a character trait, or it's a personality trait. You know, what sets them apart, you know, what sets Steve Rogers, Captain America, apart. Yes, he's super strong because he's a super soldier, but it's his the level of respect and care that he has for everyone
Exactly.
else. His personality and his character is very different. So that's Steve Rogers, and it's because of who Steve Rogers was that he became
Mhm.
Captain America. If there was no Steve Rogers, he wouldn't have become Captain America. So he had to be super before
Yeah.
he became the superhero.
Yeah. And like you said, it's always that traumatic experience that happened before they became the superheroes.
Yeah. And so he, I think it was probably traumatic becoming the superhero because it didn't look like it was any fun.
Right.
But he was part of, I mean, it was war, you know, I mean, he was created as, you know, war propaganda. But then, you know, he lost his friend in the war. He lost a lot of people that he cared about in the war. And then he ended up, you know, going into the ice for decades, and coming out and the whole world was completely different. So a lot of loss that was happening there in his storyline. But again, that character of who he was before he became the superhero
Yeah.
is central
That's
to
what made
him
him.
and stays whether he's Captain America or not. So
Yeah.
that concept, right, for a lot of them, it's who they were as a person that lends to the kind of hero that they are. So you can't have the hero without having who they were and who they are as a person inside.
And everything that they've been through.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's something that everybody can relate to that, right? I mean, we know so many people who've been through traumatic experiences, and through their healing will describe that they discovered the power that they have
Exactly.
in that process.
Because of everything that they've been through. You know, maybe a victim of sexual assault may go choose to work at a rape crisis center. And so they're using their traumatic experience as a superpower. And I
Yeah.
think that's something we can all look up to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think it's a good time to go see if we have any questions, comments?
Oh yeah, I forgot about the questions part.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
might not have any, but let's see if maybe we do. Maybe we have a
Okay.
few questions. Zach, can you check for us?
Okay, just checking now, and I don't see any
Okay.
questions for right now.
Maybe we'll have some questions later. We can always answer them. Even if it's not live, we can answer them in the comments.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
I don't know if I do. I think my challenge for you all is the next time you watch a superhero movie to point out the traumatic experiences, because they're there.
Yes. Yeah. And basically what I wanted to close off with is what we already kind of covered a little bit, is that we can all be superheroes. We can all relate with these superheroes. We can play our part, do our role. And, you know, not all the superheroes are wearing capes and spandex. We have a lot of moms, a lot of dads, a lot of superheroes out here doing what we can.
Yeah, absolutely. They give us something to escape to. They give us something to relate to. They give us examples, things to identify with. But there are people around us every single day that are
Exactly.
heroes too.
Well, thank you so much for doing this with us, Jennifer. Thank you all for watching. We'll be back next month for another tea episode, and I'll see you all then.
Thanks, Celeste.
Bye.
Bye.